While the recent decades have shown a rise in the increase of religious nuns, that rise has not yet translated into increasing support for explicitly secular organizations. The question of why so few Americans publicly support atheist or humanist organizations has nothing to do with a lack of agreement and everything to do with the associated cost. Across the U.S., for people of many backgrounds, Christianity is not just a belief system. It functions as culture, identity, memory, and in many cases, a fragile form of social protection. Stepping away from that or aligning oneself with secular institutions publicly isn't merely a theological shift. It is a relational, economic, cultural, and sometimes even political risk. What we're unpacking today applies to anyone whose sense of stability, belonging, or social legitimacy is tied to a religious environment. The issue is not just belief, the issue is infrastructure, identity, and the absence of a viable secular alternative that knows how to support the whole human being. Let's get into it. Here are 9 reasons many atheists are not joining the club of secular organization. Number one, Christianity equals cultural identity, not belief. For many Americans, Christianity is not just a religion, it's a cultural inheritance. It's tied to family structure, music, memory, community rituals, and social expectations, and for some, protection in hostile environments. So, supporting atheism or any form of implicit secularism can feel like betraying culture, not just changing beliefs. Even Black atheists often still feel that pull to just do it for the culture. Number two is the fear of repercussions. For some people in the US, coming out as an atheist is not just a worldview shift, it's a socio-economic risk, a high cost one. Publicly supporting an atheist or secular organization can mean losing family support, being cut off from communal networks that have historically functioned as survival structures. It could even mean career damage, especially across the South, Midwest, and the Black and Bible Belt, being labeled dangerous, rebellious, immoral, or not raised right, and even social and relational isolation. Unlike some atheists who often lose belief, many Black atheists often risk losing belief plus belonging plus basic and formal safety nets. The cost feels exponentially higher, and yet secular organizations rarely account for that cost. Atheist and humanist organizations frequently say they want more diversity, but they are woefully unaware of the Black tax in the US, ill equipped to understand the social and economic penalties Black atheists pay, and overwhelmingly uninvested in the economics required to support Black secularists who are choosing to cross that line. So even when Black atheists take the leap and engage with white secular spaces, they often experience double taxation. They pay the Black tax for leaving their faith community in the form of loss of family, communal support, suspicion, and relational rupture. But then they also pay the secular tax, the expectation to keep up with conferences, conventions, memberships, travel, and appearances in organizations that offer none of the social or economic buffers or benefits they just lost. Most atheists lose ritual, but some atheists lose infrastructure. Most atheists lose a belief system, but some atheists often lose their support system. And the very organizations claiming to welcome them often provide no replacement, no investment, and no scaffolding, only polite applause for representation. This is why so many remain quiet, even if they agree. It's not fear of ideas, it's fear of fallout. It's fear of paying a cost no one helps them recover from. Black atheists must weigh every choice against the real risk: economic instability, broken family ties, community estrangement, and loss of cultural legitimacy. Until secular organizations understand those material realities and invest accordingly, their calls for diversity will remain hollow. Let's move into number three: assimilation survival strategy. Now, here's a caveat. Though I'm sharing this from the perspective of an African American in the US, I am acutely aware that the issues that I highlight in this conversation are not isolated to race alone, and that there are countless others who share many of these experiences due to perceived class, couth, or creed. And so, if any of this resonates with you, regardless of your race, please speak up and share your experience so that others may know and learn. Because while there is a clear lack of Black people in secular spaces, there are also countless other secularists who are just as resistant to joining any organized efforts currently available. If we are as progressive as we claim to be, we should be committed to understanding the why. Let's get into it. So, for 400 years in the US, survival for Black people wasn't about choosing religion. It was about navigating a violent racial hierarchy using the tools available. That meant developing strategies that signaled safety, compliance, and non threatening proximity to power. Black survival often required coding behavior to avoid white suspicion, performing respectability to counter racist projections, suppressing autonomy in exchange for tolerance, and public alignment with dominant Christian norms to avoid being labeled dangerous, immoral, or subversive, and adopting the language of piety to disarm white hostility. Under these conditions, Christian identity was not primarily a spiritual identity, it was a survival coded identity. Not I believe, but I submit to be safe. Christian affiliation functioned as a social safety identifier. It told white society that I'm one of the safe ones, I'm a compliant one, I'm a good Negro. I accept the moral order as you've defined it. This wasn't faith, it was forced signaling, a protective performance under threat of punishment, exclusion, or even. Number four, humanist and atheist organizations don't yet feel like home. When Black people leave religion in the United States, they aren't simply stepping out of a belief system. They're stepping out of the closest thing that the U.S. has allowed Black communities to build that resemble a home base, a place with ritual, culture, belonging, intergenerational continuity, and emotional nourishment. White led secular organizations, by contrast, have never had to serve that function, so they don't. What Black people are used to, historically and culturally, are spaces that are warm, familiar, communally structured, emotionally intelligent, family oriented, intergenerational, and built on shared struggle and shared survival. The Black church, despite its theological problems, offered mutual care, emotional literacy, communal support networks, interpersonal accountability, and a place to be seen, known, and recognized. It wasn't about doctrine, it was about infrastructure. What most secular organizations offer instead is content, conferences, and conflict, not community, not continuity, not care, not a culture that feels lived in rather than theoretical. It's religion free gatherings rather than human centered ecosystems. And because these spaces are usually white led, they reflect more Western cultural norms: emotional minimalism, interpersonal distance, intellectualizing everything, avoidance of cultural expressive communications, valuing debate over connection, and valuing ideas over people, just to name a few. This is not what Black secularists recognize as home, and I'm sure we're not the only ones. When Black atheists cross that secular threshold, we lose family, community, culture, identity markers, social safety indicators, emotional support, economic support, and intergenerational networks. You cannot subtract that much and replace it with a conference and a Facebook group. Black people don't support what doesn't feed them emotionally. You can't ask Black seculars to join organizations that feel cold, detached, uninterested in culture, that feel allergic to emotion or distant from lived reality, that feel hostile to Black expressive communication, that feel transactional instead of relational, or feel like they want Black bodies without Black experiences or expressions. People only commit to spaces that feed them, not spaces that drain them. And until secular institutions learn to cultivate belonging, mutual care, intergenerational thinking, and culturally intelligent leadership, they will never feel like home for most Black atheists in the US. White secular institutions have ideology. That's real cute. But communities need infrastructure, culture, and care. That gap is the reason most Black non-believers stay silent, stay isolated, or build their own spaces rather than join existing ones. Let's get into number five. There's a distrust of non-religious institutions, especially in my community. There is a widespread inherited suspicion among many Black communities that anything outside of religion, especially anything explicitly secular, is foreign, unsafe, culturally incompatible, or an agent of assimilation into whiteness. Just run through a few of my comments and you will run into this. This distrust is not random. It's historically conditioned and psychologically reinforced across generations who survived under systems that punished independence and rewarded compliance. These narratives show up again and again. Black atheism is a white agenda. This belief emerges from centuries in which Black autonomy was framed as dangerous unless it aligned with white expectations. Since Christianity was the only ideology white society allowed Black communities to build institutions around, Anything outside of that is perceived as outside influence. The next one is losing God equals losing your moral center. Now, this is not theology, it's indoctrination. It stems from the racist stereotype that Black people need religion to be moral, disciplined, or civilized. Centuries of propaganda taught both Black and white communities that secular Black people are inherently untrustworthy or too damn free. The third one is that secularism is assimilation into whiteness. Black people in the US have been told explicitly and implicitly that abandoning Christianity means abandoning Black culture, family, upbringing, and identity. Because white secular institutions dominate the landscape, leaving the church can feel like stepping into an identity that is not one's own. These narratives are psychologically sticky not because they are true, but because they have functioned as defensive walls protecting against centuries of cultural erasure and existential danger. The real origins of this distrust is clear. Black people were never given opportunities to build non religious institutions, not because they didn't want to, but because the United States did not allow them. Black schools, often Christian. Black social groups, often church based. Black mutual aid, usually religious. Black leadership pipelines, dominated by clergy. Historically, Black political organizing that was allowed to survive tended to be rooted in churches, not because the church was the natural or only site of Black existence or resistance, but because it was the only type of organizing the U.S. tolerated without immediate state repression. Black secular political movements did exist and they were punished for it. The United States treated Black secular organizing as inherently subversive, dangerous, and uncontrollable. More than 90% of Black secular, socialist, humanist, or atheist leaning political movements were targeted by COINTELPRO, the FBI, the CIA, local police intelligence units, Red Scare McCarthy era crackdowns, federal surveillance and infiltration, disinformation campaigns, character assassinations, imprisonment, and political assassinations. And yet, the KKK persists without ever having been bombed or having their leaders assassinated. See, they weren't targeted because they were violent. It was because Black and secular together equals no longer one of the safe Negroes. The distrust is structural, not irrational. Even though the narrative is false, the psychology is real. Historically, Black freethinkers, skeptics, and humanists existed long before many white atheist institutions. Black radical movements often rejected religious authority. Secular thought shaped abolition, the Harlem Renaissance, civil rights critiques, and Black intellectual life. Black secularists have been cultural innovators, not assimilators. But trauma, historical restriction, and intergenerational conditioning mean that the story secularism equals whiteness still feels emotionally true, even though it's historically false. And because most mainstream secular institutions are overwhelmingly white led and culturally tone deaf, they unintentionally reinforce that distrust instead of dismantling it. Black communities distrust secular institutions not because secularism is foreign to Black identity, but because the United States denied Black people the freedom to build secular institutions in the first place. The distrust is a trauma response, and unless secular spaces intentionally address that history, they will remain alien to the very people they claim to want in the room. Let's move on to number 6 and get back to the bigger picture. People support what supports them. Most people in the United States have never supported institutions purely out of ideology. We support ecosystems, communities that show up for us in every dimension of life: relational, emotional, social, and definitely practical. This is where most secular organizations fail, not because their ideas are wrong, but because their institutions lack the architecture of human life. For many atheists, this isn't an issue because their community infrastructure already exists outside the atheist space in the form of social normalization. But for Black secularists and many others, leaving religion means losing the only community infrastructure the US ever permitted you to have. So when these folks step into mainstream secular spaces, what they find is ideas without embodiment, institutions without community, philosophy without practice, gatherings without belonging, and leadership without care. These spaces don't feel like a village, they feel like a club, or worse, a debate society disguised as a community. And when you're in the middle of the fight of your life to rebuild everything you've lost without any infrastructure, debates get old and unattractive real quick. Number 7, the church still controls the narrative. For many people in the United States, leaving the church doesn't mean escaping its reach. It simply means you're no longer inside while everything around you still is. Even those who don't attend church are surrounded by people and institutions that remain deeply governed by Christian norms. Christianity, in that sense, is not merely a belief system, it is a cultural enforcement mechanism in American life. Black cultural gatekeepers reinforce this narrative. Entertainers, comedians, and influencers routinely reinforce the Christian persona as the safe, respectable identity, even when they don't live by it privately or publicly. Some go further and actively shame non believers. Steve Harvey has publicly mocked atheists as ignorant, immoral, and beneath consideration on multiple occasions for no other reason than he wants to. Public black personalities who fall from grace must often perform a religious redemption arc because nothing else is culturally accepted as rehabilitation. Remember Will Smith? After the Oscars incident, suddenly he's appearing on a gospel feature to symbolically return to the fold. How about Jonathan Majors? He adopted an exaggerated religious persona to signal humility, repentance, and cultural acceptability. This isn't a coincidence, it's a formula, a pathway back into the public's forgiveness controlled by the cultural gatekeepers of respectability politics. Let's move on to number 8. Atheist messaging often feels combative rather than constructive. Most people who step back from religion already agree with the critiques. They know the manipulation, they see the hypocrisy, they recognize the harm. They've lived it. The issue isn't the critique, the issue is what comes after. And this is where many atheist and secular organizations in the United States fall short. They lead with destruction and offer nothing for reconstruction. Critique without construction does not resonate with communal cultures. You can't ask people to walk out of the only community structure they've ever had into a movement that proudly offers no structure at all. You can't expect people to leave a system that, despite its flaws, offered belonging, intergenerational relationships, child centered spaces, community care, and leadership pathways for a secular landscape that offers arguments, podcasts, conventions, and vibes, bruh. There's no equivalence. Secularism requires construction, not just critique. We need frameworks for building ethical communities, healing from indoctrination, creating secular ceremonies, raising children without religious trauma, forming identity outside Christian norms, crafting shared meaning without superstition, and offering emotional and communal support. Humanist organizations that fail to build these structures will never resonate with many communities, no matter how correct their arguments are, because communities don't grow on rejection. They grow on reconstruction. And until secular institutions learn that, they will continue to attract only the people who enjoy debate culture, not the people who are trying to build new liberated ways of living for the rest of us. And finally, number 9. People are already fighting on many fronts. For many people in the United States, everyday life is not a neutral landscape. It is a terrain marked by constant struggle, economic instability, healthcare disparities, workplace discrimination, policing, housing insecurity, and educational inequity shape the daily atmosphere. Survival is not theoretical, it is practical, immediate, and damn near demanding. Under these conditions, the idea of taking on an additional ideological battle can feel impossible. This is why, when secular organizations ask people to join the fight against religion, many quietly think I'm already fighting for my life. I don't have the bandwidth to fight for another war. The concerns are not about whether religion is true. Many people already recognize its flaws and manipulation. The hesitation comes from the reality of limited emotional, financial, and psychological capacity. When someone is navigating racial hostility at work, instability at home, or exhaustion from simply trying to raise their children safely, taking on the cultural and relational fallout of abandoning religion can feel like stepping into chaos. For many, atheist identity feels like a luxury, something people engage with once their basic needs are stable. But most people do not have that stability. When the week is already filled with navigating discriminatory systems, protecting family members, trying to advance in workplaces steeped in religious assumptions, and managing economic pressures, the questions become less about belief and more about preservation. What will happen to my relationships, my community, my support network, my sense of safety, my job, my children? It's not that the critique of religion is unimportant, it's that life is already too heavy to add another burden. The church, despite its flaws, still offers tangible forms of support: an informal safety net, community recognition, childcare, moral framing, and a sense of belonging. Even people who long ago outgrew the theology often rely on the infrastructure. Atheism, in contrast, frequently offers correct ideas, but no community, no emotional scaffolding, and no practical support. It asks people to walk away from their last source of stability without offering a new one. So, atheist identity doesn't fall low on the priority list because people don't care. It falls low because that list is already overflowing. The mental and emotional energy required to be openly secular has to compete with the energy required to stay alive, stay housed, stay healthy, keep a job, nurture children, and weather discrimination in every sphere. People can only fight so many battles at once, and most people are already fighting on all sides. Until secular spaces begin to address real needs, material, emotional, and communal, atheism and humanism will continue to feel like a fight that demands more from people than it gives back. And when a community is exhausted, unsupported, and overburdened, any identity that adds weight rather than relieving it will always become the last thing people can afford to hold. If there's one thing I hope this conversation makes clear, it's that most people aren't rejecting atheism. They're rejecting the vacuum that follows. They're rejecting the idea of tearing down the only community they've ever known, the only cultural anchor they've ever had, the only emotional infrastructure they've ever been allowed to build in exchange for nothing but arguments, podcasts, and a conference every once in a while. People don't avoid secular spaces because they're irrational or afraid of ideas. They avoid them because these spaces don't yet meet the human needs that religion, despite all its harm, has historically monopolized. And the people with the most to lose, whether because of race, class, immigration status, or simply the weight of their own lives, they feel that gap most intensely. This isn't a call for secular organizations to imitate religion. It's a call to understand what religion has provided, not the metaphysics, but the infrastructure, the continuity, the belonging, the identity work, the intergenerational care, the village making, and to build something better, something grounded in reason and honesty, yes, but also in warmth, in culture and community, something that doesn't ask people to forfeit their last safety net without offering a new one, something that doesn't just critique the world we inherited, but constructs the world we need, because the truth is simple. People support what supports them. If secularism wants to grow, it must learn how to support people, not just in ideas, but in life. When we build communities that feed the human spirit, that honor culture without superstition, that offer belonging without belief, that create safety without submission, then people won't hesitate to step forward. They won't be choosing against religion, they'll be choosing for themselves. And maybe that's the real future of humanism. Not a movement that tears people away from their past, but one that gives them a future worth walking toward. Bridge City Global has kicked off our first official open house week, man. We had a wildly successful orientation and introduction yesterday, followed by a hilarious night of laughter and life with members from Malaysia all the way to Montgomery playing Pictionary together. Every day of this week, our community is hosting events to introduce our global campus. And at the end of the week, we're capping off open house with a community movie night. If you've been looking for a place to belong without beliefs driving the conversation, we're building it at Bridge City. Our mission is clear: to connect better, build better, and live better because people matter. Join our global campus today to get connected. Thank you all for watching today's video and supporting the channel. Until next time, keep rising.